Okay, great. Yes. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. So I think as ABRÃO can tell you, we've been trying for quite a long time to bring our speaker here to Colombia, so I'm really, really pleased that we've managed. So ABRÃO Neto is the Executive Vice President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Brazil, which has membership or works with 5,000 Brazilian U.S. companies, I think. ABRÁO can correct that. But we actually met in his former capacity when he was Secretary of Foreign Trade in Brazil. In which capacity he was handling a lot of the issues related to negotiations, including as Director of Negotiations. And we take particular interest because of Brazil's unique and innovative approach to investment treaties, investment agreements. So we're particularly grateful for you to come and share your experiences. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, Kabir. I'm very glad about the invitation, and extremely happy to be back to Colombia. I had the opportunity to be here back in 2015. As Lisa mentioned, I was representing the Brazilian government in a discussion on the reform of investment agreements and on the negotiations of those agreements. By then, Brazil was still beginning its journey to become a member of the global network of investment agreements. And I guess we have evolved a great deal, so I would be more than happy to share some remarks on that subject with you here. But I guess that before talking about the current state of play of Brazil's investment agreements, I would like to give a quick dive in our recent history regarding this subject. So Brazil started negotiating, following the global trend of BITs. We started negotiating and signed 14 traditional investment agreements in the 90s, mainly with European countries, all of them with developed countries, mainly European ones. And the reason behind that was the understanding that we needed to protect investments in order to attract more investments. So we had these negotiations going, and then the Brazilian government sent part of those investment agreements to the Brazilian Congress for examination. And the Brazilian Congress had a different view on the contents of those agreements. So they found out, or they thought that those agreements would give a more beneficial treatment to foreign investors over national ones, and also it might restrict our rights to regulate. It could diminish our policy space. So Congress signaled that it would reject those agreements that were there for examination, and then the Brazilian government had to face a very hard choice between insisting in having those agreements approved with a very high chance of having them rejected, or withdrawing those agreements in order not to create a political embarrassment. And the decision was to withdraw them, and they did so back in 2002. I guess that it was interesting to notice that in spite of the lack of BITs, Brazil continued to attract a fair amount of FDI. I don't want to go into the discussion on the quality or on the diversity of that FDI, but I guess there is no dispute about the volumes. Brazil was always, or it has been more recently, a very important FDI recipient in the world. And I guess one of the main reasons for that was, first, we have a very impressive domestic market with more than 200 million people. We have good access to natural resources, so in areas as agriculture, mining, energy, fuel, a lot of companies are interested in Brazil. We have very high prospects for the return on investment, and in some cases, you would see foreign companies acquiring Brazilian companies in order to skip complex regulations and standards. So companies that already have some licenses, they will go there, acquire them, and it would make life easier. Still on the numbers of FDI attraction, you can see that in the past decade, I guess in every year, with the exception of 2009, our FDI inflow was above $50 billion. So this is an interesting number to show the force of attraction by Brazil. And well, we're first one in Latin America, 2018. This is data from the OECD. We attracted $59 billion. It was more than Mexico and Argentina altogether. And we have been in the top 10 destinations for FDIs in the world. In this specific year, we were number 6. Okay, but going back to the discussions on investment agreements, I guess that the traumatic process that we lived regarding the BITs somehow made Brazil go through a period of hibernation. The discussion on investment agreements in Brazil became a taboo, and we pretty much got into a situation where we had a binary option. Either we would insist in new BITs, and the likely outcome would be the Congress to reject them, or we could do nothing. And that was the option that we had, and that was exactly what we did. We sat still for quite some time during the years 2000s. Not much happened. We went through a period of paralysis, and this led to the isolation of Brazil in the global context of international investment agreements. If I'm not mistaken, only Brazil and Mongolia by then did not have any investment agreements in force. But while we were somehow, the discussions on investment agreements were frozen, some movements started to happen under this ice cap. So first, we saw Brazil emerge as a relevant foreign investor. And if you see the numbers here, we have grew our outbound investment by 6 to 7 times in the past 18 years, passing from $50 billion in 2001 to more than $380 billion last year. And also we started to see a process where our companies started to expand abroad. So this is a snapshot of the main destinations of Brazilian companies in the world. So you'd see the United States leading the charts. Then there are a number of Latin American countries, including Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, and Uruguay. You have some European countries and also China. So the thing is, this new perspective somehow revived Brazil's interest in investment agreements, not only on the government side, but also on the business sector side. And it led to a search for alternatives to break the ice, to end that Brazilian winter period. And the important thing here is that we wanted to keep attracting FDIs, but we also wanted to support our companies abroad, and we did not want to ignore what the Congress has expressed as a message of concern regarding traditional BITs. So all of this combined made us starting to develop a new generation of investment agreements that were named as cooperation and facilitation investment agreements. Now I would like to go into some of those details, starting with the process, the building process of those agreements. Of course, we had contributions from different sources, but I guess that there was a very intense exchange with the Brazilian business sector. And in order, of course, to try and learn what were their needs, what were their concerns. And in those conversations, I guess that the key question they were asked was, what could make a difference in your investment? And I can share a personal experience on that. By then, I was not working for the Brazilian government. I was in the private sector. I was working in a large entity that represents companies from the industrial sector. And I got a phone call from a representative of the Brazilian government saying, well, we're trying to come up with something new. We're in a sort of a catch-22. We don't know what to do. So we want to start a process of conversations with companies, small, medium, large-size companies, to understand what they face in their daily business. Could you help us out in trying to do that? And then we started to arrange a sort of meetings and doing some research with companies to try to identify and map this landscape. And the funny thing, or which surprised us the most, was that the companies were not asking for ISDS clauses or for indirect expropriation clauses. They were more concerned on very practical issues that could help them on their daily activities, on their day-to-day business. So part of the answers we got was that it would be important for them to have greater institutional support from the Brazilian government. They would be benefited from focal points in the host states in order to avoid them knocking at different doors and having different answers to the same question. They would welcome more access to information on regulation, on investment opportunities. They would like some support in reducing investment barriers, and also they would like to see some progress on some business agendas as business visa. So this was the chapter involving the business sectors. And of course, we also had a lot of research on the studies that international organizations as UNCTAD and the OECD were doing, and also a benchmark of international best practices, and also one very important reference in the Brazilian experience was the South Korean ombudsman. Also a snapshot of the pillars that form part of these investment agreements. And I would like to go just in some of the details of each one of those pillars. But we have risk mitigation and dispute prevention. We have enhanced institutional governance and agendas for investment cooperation and facilitation. So let's start with the first pillar. And I guess here the main difference from traditional investment agreements is that instead of focusing on dispute settlement, we were more concerned in focusing on dispute prevention and risk mitigation. And of course, there are a number of provisions and instruments you can use to try to do that. So we were investing in some clauses regarding non-discrimination, rules for direct expropriation, more rules to foster transparency and to share access to information. We also were very much concerned about building mechanisms to prevent disputes based on dialogue and bilateral consultations with the other party, and we'll go into that in the second pillar of the enhanced institutional governance, because those are the instruments that allow for the dispute prevention to take place. This specific generation of investment agreements do not have ISDS or indirect expropriation clauses. And here, I guess it was more a practical, a very pragmatic approach, taking into consideration what our Congress had already expressed and also what we heard from the Brazilian companies. So we didn't want to risk the chance of bringing those clauses to our investment agreements and then having the likelihood of having them rejected by the Brazilian Congress. So, in other words, we didn't want to invest resource, time, and have the same result as happened with the traditional BITs. And of course, if the dispute cannot be avoided, then there are some state-to-state dispute settlement mechanisms in order to try to solve the disputes. Then on the second pillar, and I guess this is probably the heart of the agreement, are the clauses or the instruments on institutional governance. And basically we have two important actors here. First is the designation of national ombudsperson or focal points in each party to the agreement. And second, we have the development, the creation of a joint committee comprised by government representatives from both parties to the agreement. The focal points, well, this is not, of course, not something new. As I mentioned, the South Korean experience has a very interesting and very solid result when it comes to focal points. And you can gather examples all over the world. But the idea here was to have a single window for foreign investors, to have a body that would act as a facilitator between the foreign investor and the government of the host country. But it would also help to provide information on aspects that are relevant for investments, and also addresses specific complaints, requests, or a specific situation that could arise while investing in a country. And in this role, the focal points also could act to prevent disputes and improve FDI. On the other hand, the joint committee would be a more formal, bilateral institutional framework that would monitor, it would oversee the implementation of the agreement, but also provides information, also help in solving disputes if they arise. And one thing that I guess it's very interesting is that the Joint Committee has the possibility to create ad hoc groups with the participation of the civil society and of specific business sectors. Then, to close this overview of the Brazilian agreement, you would have the third pillar, which are the working agendas for investment cooperation and facilitation. I guess that the most emblematic ones are the business visas. So in some of the agreements, beyond negotiating the investment agreement themselves, we were negotiating new provisions to facilitate business visas, to enlarge the period of stay or the duration of those visas for Brazil. But we could also go into aspects related to the cooperation on domestic regulations, on any area of mutual interest, from sustainable development to monetary cooperation. And also we brought the corporate social responsibility clauses in a voluntary way, in a way to engage investors in a more responsible behavior that could contribute to the development of the country receiving the investments. And this specific pillar, it gives the agreement a format of a living agreement, because once you conclude the negotiation of the agreement, you may continue to negotiate specific aspects that expand the scope of this agreement. So it makes this instrument a very dynamic one. Here is the photograph of the number of investment agreements that Brazil has concluded. So since 2015, we have finished agreements with 17 countries. We have a regional investment agreement within Mercosur, which is the trading regional bloc that Brazil belongs to, comprising Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. We have bilateral agreements with all of the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Chile. We also have agreements in South America with Ecuador, Suriname, and Guyana. In Africa, we have agreements with 5 countries, including the ones that Brazil invests the most, which are Angola and Mozambique, but always Malawi, Ethiopia, and Morocco. And we have an agreement with the United Arab Emirates, and you see the time clock. We had concluded a negotiation with India, but we still haven't signed this agreement. Besides that, I guess it is important to mention that we are negotiating as part of our FTA's chapters on investment. We have just concluded a negotiation with the European Union. You won't see investment clauses over there, but the negotiations, more recent negotiations we're having with Canada, with South Korea, with Singapore, there are some aspects of investment facilitation and also investment protection, but this is something still undergoing, but perhaps it will be a very important way to develop the Brazilian model as it stands now. Another thing, I guess, which is of utmost importance here is that for the first time, Brazil has crossed the line of having bilateral investment agreements approved by our Congress. So several of those agreements were already approved. We have 3 of them in force, the one with Mercosur, the one with Mexico, and the one with Angola. We have other ones which were approved, but we are waiting for the other party to conclude their internal procedures. And the other investment agreements are being analyzed by the Brazilian Congress. But the reception, I guess, was completely different from the reception they had in the 90s. And I could share also some personal experience here. The first time we sent one type of disagreement to Congress, we had a not very welcome reception for some congressmen and from some of the staffers over there, because they thought that what Congress had expressed previously was not taken into consideration. So they would say, well, you're insisting in the same mistake all over again, and you should respect what Congress thinks. And it took a while to make to pursue a more clear message of what the differences between traditional BITs and the differences between this model of agreements were. And I guess this was fundamental for having them approved in Congress as it is now. Also, the coverage of these agreements are very important when one takes into consideration the main destination of our companies investing abroad. So 7 out of the 10 main destinations are covered by those agreements. The missing ones are the United States, China, and United Kingdom, but the 7 others we have investment agreements, many of them in force. And also, part of this experience, we are now seeing in some very important multilateral or international discussions. So there's one really interesting that is taking place at the WTO. You will know that in 2017, in the ministerial conference in Buenos Aires, 70 countries adopted a ministerial declaration saying that they wanted to work together to have structured discussions in order to build a multilateral framework. And in this, I guess, probably last week or a couple of weeks ago, there was another ministerial declaration now with 90 countries. It's raised from 70 to 90 countries, showing support to the development of those discussions at the WTO and showing some willingness to see concrete results by the time of the next ministerial conference. Of course, the discussion at the WTO do not does not include market access, investment protection, dispute settlement. It focuses on investment facilitation, and it is, to a certain extent, very much inspired in the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO, which has different conditions and timetables for developing countries. Also, on a more regional level, we are debating this issue within the BRICS groups. So in 2017, in the summit in India, the 5 countries adopted a framework for investment facilitation. And last week, if I'm not mistaken, the summit was held in Brasilia. And you had the Brazilian, and well, actually you had the business communities from all of the 5 countries presenting recommendations on investment facilitations to the governments, because they thought that this would be a good deliverable within the discussions that are taking place in this group. And then just to conclude, I guess it is important to, well, it's obvious, but it's important to stress that agreements are means, not an end. And in order for this agreement to reach a positive outcome, the Brazilian government and the private sector needs to put the agreements and its pieces into work. They need to put that to well use, and you have a number of ways in which this can be done. The first one is to structure properly the tools that are foreseen in the agreement. For instance, the focal points and the joint committees. You have some recommendations, very interesting ones from the World Bank, that says, for instance, that focal points should be structured with a network of other focal points within a country, with representatives from different agencies that are involved in investment decisions. They also recommend that the country having a focal point should have a very strong campaign to make this body known to the whole audience, to the potential users of the focal points. And also you need some rules to regulate how it will work and in how long it has to reply to the requests from the private sector. You need to engage the business sector, otherwise it will be an agreement without use. And you need to make a very special effort to channel requests and complaints that are received by the governments to those instruments, to make the focal points and the joint committee really work on those issues and try to solve them in a good way, and even take advantage of those complaints to try to enhance the investment environment in the domestic environment. There are 2 other steps that I guess Brazil should focus on. The first is to negotiate practical investment facilitation agendas. So as I said, for instance, we have an agreement with Mercosur, so we should keep continuing to negotiate specific issues that would make the bilateral or the regional environment for investments better, and you have a door to do that through the agreements. And finally, we need to expand the network of countries that have those agreements with Brazil. We need to go from 17 to 20 to 25 and so on. I guess that, well, as the saying goes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And in my opinion, we have a very good looking pudding. I guess that it managed to win its first test, which was get out of the kitchen, being approved by the Brazilian Congress. The first spoonful also tasted good, but I guess there are a lot to do in order to give more consistency, more substance, more results to the Brazilian model. We still need to keep improving the recipe. I guess that the negotiations have been a very interesting learning curve for Brazil. And if you compare the first investment agreement to the last one, you will see some very important differences over there. And you need to keep your clients satisfied. You need to keep the foreign investors, the business companies, the business entities satisfied. And that if we manage to do so, I guess we will be able to gain a Michelin star for this pudding and see if it is a good thing in the discussions of the global network of investment agreements. But I'll stop here, and I'll be more than glad to keep discussing with you other aspects of the agreement.
Great.
Thank you
so much. I have a few questions, but I'll defer if there are others who would like to start. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question was what your expectations were for whether any of these kind of cooperation facilitation agreements will be signed with the US and China, and what the obstacles to that might be.
Okay, well, with the US, we have been in a sort of a scoping exercise for quite some time now. I guess that changes in how the US administration views investment agreements, and more particularly ISDS clauses, could benefit a possible beginning of a conversation between the two countries. But still, I guess we need a fair deal of conversations. And of course, next year you're having elections here, so I'm not sure if the political environment would be appropriate to start talking about an investment agreement. But just to give you a very concrete example, in July we had in Brazil the visit of the US Secretary of Commerce, and when asked what areas could the two countries evolve, he mentioned, well, investment agreement could be something we could work on. So maybe there is something there, and maybe we may see something happening next year. With China, at least as far as I'm concerned, all the attempts to initiate a discussion on investment agreement with them on a bilateral level did not succeed. But they are strong supporters of the discussions at the WTO. They have been pushing some of those discussions forward. The ministerial declaration that was signed this month, it was during a meeting in China, and I know that the Chinese government was pretty much engaged in trying to use that as an example of an area that could deliver results for the next ministerial conference of the WTO. So I would say not in the bilateral level, but including in BRICS and at the WTO, they I guess are important allies for this issue.
It was a very great presentation, and I found many similar things. I'm from Azerbaijan with our legislation. Just I wanted to know, do you have in your legislation the certain provisions which encourages investment for the certain areas? It could be by industrial or by territorial. Because we have just about 2 years ago, we give them privileges in taxing and so on. So especially government gives these privileges for the areas which is government interested to be, raised up. So
I don't think, thank you very much, but I don't think we have clauses that try to direct investment in one or other sectors. We have, as I mentioned, some clauses on corporate social responsibility, which somehow tries to stimulate more responsible investment. And we have the possibility of the working agendas. And in some cases, for instance, with Colombia, we have negotiated some specific commitments in the industrial sector and in areas that we thought we could have a more regional integration value chain. But the regular model, I guess you won't see those sort of incentives and those sort of direction in
so
there.
it's ad hoc, but not impermanent in the law. It's ad hoc. Okay. Thanks.
from China. Thank you for a very impressive presentation. So I wonder about the organization of a joint committee. So is it like the European Investment Court, the member from third parties, and how about the cost to solve the disputes by the joint committee?
Well, the idea of the joint committee is very different from the idea of the European Union Court. The idea here is to have a permanent bilateral framework that would allow both governments that are involved in the agreement, to meet in a regular basis in order to discuss aspects relevant for investments. And in doing so, as I mentioned, they could engage the private sector, and they could act. For instance, if you have there's a foreign investor that has a specific problem while investing in Brazil, he or she could take this problem to the Brazilian Ombudsman, ask for clarification, ask for the Brazilian Ombudsman to act together with other agencies responsible for investment in trying to solve that problem. If this is not solved, then this problem can be taken to the agenda of the joint committee in order to try, in a diplomatic effort, try to build a solution to that problem. So, in other words, what you would do is raise the political profile of the discussion, and in doing so, perhaps raise the probability of having the problem solved. And, well, if it is not solved, then, as I said, as a last resort, you could go to a state-to-state dispute settlement, and then each agreement has different rules for how to handle those disputes.
I had the question about the involvement of the civil society, because you said that they're involved in discussion with the joint committee, but you didn't mention if they were involved in the negotiation process of the treaties and of the model treaty too. You mentioned that the private sector was, but was the Brazilian civil society involved? Or?
I guess so. Perhaps it wasn't the same involvement as they had with the business, with the private sector. They had some entities that are very well known for debating investment issues in Brazil that were informally consulted, as all of the others were informally consulted, but I would say to a lesser degree than the involvement of the business sector. I guess all of the agreements allow for, and in a certain way, incentivize the involvement of civil society and business sector in the work of the joint committee. But here is a classic case of the pudding not having been tested so far. So as far as I know, we still do not have any meetings of joint committees, including of the agreements that are in force. But this could be something interesting. So if you have the first meeting of this joint committee between the 4 countries of Mercosur, this would be a great opportunity to bring other actors that are relevant for the discussion, to try to bring inputs, relevant contributions for the evolution of the agreement. That's why I said it is a living agreement. It could and it should evolve over time, but in order to do that, you definitely need the participation of people who are directly affected, impacted by those agreements.
So first of all, obrigado pela sua apresentação. My question goes to, I've reviewed mainly the Brazil-Ecuador BAT from this year, and I've seen there are issues of human rights and environmental law inserted there as ways to try to balance that with investor rights. And my question is, I know you said there were no meetings yet, but how is this joint committee composed? Because you would need then experts or people from other areas of law as well as human rights, environment law, not only just international law or investment side. So is there any composition especially for the committee in each BIT? Is it just more of an agreement that would go on the way?
Okay. Well, first of all, muito obrigado. Well, no, I guess this is a matter of more internal organization in each country to see, well, what are the relevant representatives from government or agencies that should attend to these meetings. You won't see in the agreement any binding or any instructions on that, nor you would see the network of focal points that I mentioned. This is something that is not written in the agreement, and this is each party is free to structure its own focal point in the way it thinks more appropriately. In the Brazilian case, and I didn't mention that, but you just gave me the opportunity to do so. We have an interministerial body which is called CAMEX. It's a chamber. The name is Chamber of Commerce, but it's a public body, a council of different ministries that sit to debate several issues on trade, and this agency is responsible to conduct the role of the ombudsman. And it was structured in 2017. It has structured a network of focal points. So you have more than 30 agencies represented in this larger concept of an ombudsman, including on the sub-federal level. So you have representatives from the Brazilian states, because in some cases the problem is not something of the federal competence, it's something that is happening on a regional basis. And also one important change that took place this year is that the original idea of the ombudsman was to serve the foreign investors from the countries that had agreements with Brazil. So it would be like a premium service exclusive to those foreign investors. But this year, I guess in a very wise way, they have decided to expand the scope of the ombudsman to investors from all over the world. I guess the rationale was, well, if we're doing that and we want this to work, so why would we serve only for investors from countries that we have agreements with? Why not expand to everyone? And in this way, we will contribute to having a friendlier investment environment, and we will contribute to FDI attraction. So this was a very interesting change. And we have the Brazilian Ombudsman now. They looked for support from the World Bank. They are starting a series of conversations with the private sector, with the civil society, to explain what the ombudsman is, what it can do to support investment. And the last time I checked, they have received so far 11 requests, and they've managed, so I heard, to solve all of them. It could be just very simple requests for information. Well, I have a doubt in these regulations, so could you please clarify to me what are the requirements for doing this or that? Or it could be more complex issues on specific and concrete investments. Say, well, I tried to do that, and I had a decision that is somehow damaging my investment, and then I need to do something about it. And so far, I guess it is working well. That's why I say the first spoonful tastes good, but we still have a lot to taste.
Me, a couple questions, but I'll start with one. What has been have you engaged with other countries, particularly in the region, but it doesn't have to be limited to the region, on what drove the new model? In particular, I would think what would interest them was the consultation with the business community and recognizing that the more traditional legal protections enforceable by SDS was actually not what was the primary interest of the business community. They were more interested in these other aspects. I would imagine that those learnings and that this model would be of interest to other countries, in particular, given the great state of discussion around the traditional model. So I was just wondering if you've had those discussions, what the reception has been, and to the extent that we're not seeing kind of broad uptake, why do you think that that is?
Okay, well, I would say yes, we have some of those discussions. In some cases, it took a while to try to introduce and explain what the goals and the rationale of the agreement was. In some cases, I guess that we did not have the same interests, but even though, well, we have some countries that are very well known for negotiating traditional agreements with ISDS clauses, they, I guess, could perceive the impact that those agreements could have for the bilateral investment, could have for facilitating and stimulating investments, even though they continue to think that, well, if you could take an ISDS clause here, I would be happier. So I guess it depends on each case, but perhaps even in the, or more in the region, it is the question of why not? Because we could, it is the same catch-22 situation that Brazil had in the years 2000s. If we have to go to a negotiation that would involve an ISDS clause, I fear that we might not see the light of the day in this agreement. So, considering my political constraints, this is what I have the space to do right now. And some countries thought that this was sufficiently interesting to embark on and have agreed to negotiate, to conclude negotiations, to sign the agreement, and now I guess it's up to them to make the most out of those agreements.
Great. I did have one other question. Can I ask my one other question? Fascinating. I mean, I think that the survey of the business sector is incredibly interesting. I'm wondering whether in any of the discussion there was the one step back of what are we trying to achieve with investment facilitation more broadly. You know, one of the discussions in the investment reform space is what the objectives are of the agreements. And some would say the objective is to promote investment full stop. This, I think, would, you know, achieve that or aim to achieve that. But was there any discussion of why we're trying to achieve investment, some development objectives or economic objectives or something that would underpin both the development and the role of the joint committees and the focal points and the ombudsman in recognizing what the broader objective was beyond just facilitating investment?
I guess we're in a very preliminary stage yet. I didn't see, to be very honest, this sort of discussion, or of course there is this sort of concern, but I don't think it was, at least at that time, at that point in time, the main concern was let's try to do something that can prosper in our political environment. And those questions were not the primary questions that were worked with. And once again, I guess there's still time to do that within each agreement, but this is something that we will be seeing in the future. For the first investment agreements with, mainly with the African countries, I guess the Brazilian government had more time to work with other stakeholders to understand what they could do with the agreements, which areas would be the most important. I would say that the other ones, we didn't have that much time. So if you see, for instance, the working agendas, you will see in the Angola agreement, in the Mozambique agreement, more comprehensive working agendas. If you see the latest ones, you just have, well, both parties can work on specific agendas. The joint committee will take care of that. So once the agreement is on, you might resort to that instrument. So I guess that was one of the, while we had more time in doing this preliminary research, in the first ones, I guess in the latest, that were not the case.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for letting me take those last few minutes. Please join me in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.